I want to talk about three concepts that are all sort of related in the sense that they're with evolution and sexual reproduction and that kind of thing, but they're actually quite distinct, and often people confuse them because they sort of similar names and they might seem the same. So I'm wearing these headphones because they are my microphone right now, and let's get started. So one of the concepts is in the context of microevolution. One of those mechanisms that leads to microevolution is sexual selection. Okay, so in sexual selection for microevolution, remember that's a population shifting allele frequencies. We're talking about one species and thus one and also, I guess I should say, one population. So one species all in the same area breeding together. So we're not talking about, rabbits versus squirrels. We're talking about the same population of the same squirrel species in one area. Okay, so let's call a species A, and let's say we have some males. So this is a symbol, let's write this down for a male, and let's call him A1, and we'll have another male and we'll call him A2. Okay, and then we're going to have some females. Just draw 5. These are also A species, so let's call them A1 through A5. Okay. And now let's have some mating events, okay? So let's say female A1 mates with male A1, and A2 also mates with A1, and A3 also mates with A1. Let's say A4 mates with male A2, and 5 mates with A1. Okay, so what you can see is in this one population, we have a male that's more favored for mating than the other male. Or really, A1 is a type of male, so a whole group of A1 type males versus A2. So this is when you have, one male being more attractive, and that's the sexual selection here. So what does this in the end means? It means that more of the A1 alleles get passed on to the next generation, and thus we have changes in allele frequency, and thus microevolution. Okay, so this is where you have, in the context of microevolution, sexual selection. You can pause that and write this down if you need to. Now let's look at sexual selection in the context of speciation. And specifically sympatric speciation. Again, sexual selection. Okay, so again, we're talking about one species in one population. Okay, and let's call, again, we're going to have an A1 male, and let's say we're going to have, we'll draw it further down, A2 male. Okay, and we'll have some females. So let's say this A1 male. Okay, so remember, sympatric speciation is when you have a speciation event. So one species of organism turns into two. And usually it's through allopatric, which means that species, or the population, I should say, gets split into like physically two areas. And then they change in different ways, and reproductive barriers arise. And when they come back together, they can't reproduce, or they make very infertile or sickly offspring, or at least not well-adapted offspring, and so then they're two species. Sympatric speciation is when you have the organisms becoming separate species in the same area. And one of the ways that can happen, or at least be promoted, is through sexual selection. So let's say we have a population of fish here, okay? So A1 fish, this is the male, he has a specific genotype, or we'll say phenotype, which is, due to genotype. So a specific phenotype, and in this context, let's say For example, he's a shiny male. He has shiny scales as the fish. We have A2 males with a different specific phenotype. And in the context of these fish, let's say they have dull scales. Okay. Now we have females in the population. And again, these females have specific phenotypes. Let's say these females have photoreceptors in their eyes. For example, photoreceptors that, I'll just say they detect light well. Okay, so those females, because they detect light well, they are going to preferentially mate with the shiny males. So the dull males, because they don't have, they're not shiny, they are not mated with. And so what this means is that you have a specific pairing here of females that detect light well because of their eyes and males who are shiny scales, even though shiny and dull are in the same population. Now, not just that though. Now here's the difference, is that you have a second set of characteristics that create a second pairing. So you have other types of females in the population which have a different specific phenotype. Let's say in this example, they have photoreceptors, a different form, that are extra sensitive. And so what that means is that those females have an aversion to the shiny males, meaning the males are too shiny and it hurts their eyes. I mean, I'm totally making this up, but it hurts their eyes. And so those females with the extra sensitive photoreceptors will mate with the dull males because those shiny males are not well suited for them. So you can see we have two specific pairings in the same population. So remember, this is all together. And what this does is it doesn't create a physical barrier, but it creates a reproductive barrier. And what that does is it limits gene flow. Remember, limiting gene flow is necessary for speciation, because if they just keep mating together, all of them, then you're not going to get, their alleles are just going to keep mixing. And so this creates a barrier reproductive-wise, the sexual selection, and that could lead to speciation in the same area, sympatric. Let's look at the last concept that's somewhat similar, but actually quite different. This is behavioral isolation, which is a prezygotic reproductive barrier, meaning it is a barrier that prevents mating events. That's prezygotic. Now this is very different here because we're talking about two species this time instead of one. And what this behavioral isolation, yes, it has to do with sex, but it has to do with keeping the species apart and reinforcing that speciation. So let's do an example. We have our males and females again, and I'm going to call it A species and B species. So we're going to have a species A male. And let's just describe him first. So species A male, let's say it's a bird, okay? and this bird has a phenotype. Say it's a specific mating behavior. It can also be a specific behavior of like a pollinator. So it's not that the plants themselves are having a behavior, but it could also be a pollinator having a behavior which influences how the flowers get pollinated and fertilized. But we'll just do this more straightforward example of a specific mating behavior like in these birds. Let's say they do tail ruffling. So they spread their tail out and wiggle it around. Okay, so that tail ruffling during the mating process is necessary for species A females to mate. Okay. So she requires a specific mating behavior. For example, tail ruffling. So we have other males of a different species. And a lot of times we're talking about very closely related species. So let's say two species of anoles, those lizards that live in the same area, or two species of the birds of paradise that live in the same area, the salamanders that live in the same area. But it's a separate species already. And this one, let's say it has no tail ruffling. So what this means in the end, right, is that species A, which requires tail ruffling, is going to mate with the male that tail ruffles, which is her same species. But she does not mate and if you can't distinguish between red and green, it doesn't matter. But for those of you who can, I'm drawing it in different colors. But the yes and the no, so the female doesn't mate with the male that doesn't tail ruffle, and thus she doesn't mix her genes with species B. So what this creates in the end is reinforcing that barrier, preventing those species from fusing, if you want to consider that. So it doesn't mate because no tail ruffling. Great. Let's review. We have sexual selection leading to microevolution when one particular type of male is favored by all the females of the same species in the same area, same population. That shifts the allele frequencies, microevolution, towards whatever A1 male has. We also have sexual selection in sympatric speciation, where you have now two sets of males and females, which tend to mate with each other. This is still one population in the same area, and it's limiting gene flow because they have had that pairing, which then might lead to a speciation event. Lastly, we have behavioral isolation, which now we're talking about two species, and this is reinforcing the barrier between those. So we have a certain type of mating behavior, which is required for the female to mate with the male, and thus she only mates with the males of the species of her species because those are the only ones that do the behavior. So hopefully you can see that these are three very distinct phenomena, even though they all do have to do with sex in the context of evolution.